Well, hello again everyone. This is Peter Scove at Music is a Journey. Today's video is something that I'm going to basically just call Connections. This is a video idea that I scribbled down way back in 2019. And recently somebody left a comment on one of my videos. I think it was the one about the moon, and he wrote a kind of Connections style comment in my, comment for me, and I thought, you know what, maybe it's about time that I did my Connections thing. So what this Connections thing is all about is that we're going to start with a musician. And we're going to look at a band he was in. And then we're going to talk about someone else in the band who was connected to another musician who was in another band. Who's connected to another musician who was in another band. And we're going to try to go all the way around and bring it back full circle again. Now originally when I started this, it was a bunch of albums that I have. However, as I was playing with this and stretching it out, I ran into some albums that I either used to have but don't have anymore, and a couple that I just don't have. So just for the fun of bringing this like one big loop around, I'm going to mention a few of the albums that I don't have. So the person we're starting out with is Carmine Appice. Alright, first of all, it is Carmine, not Carmen, it is Carmine. And secondly, I finally found out how his name is pronounced, at least his artist name. It is Appice. It was Bobby Gaylor, who has a YouTube channel here and frequently comments on my videos. Thank you, Bobby, in case you're watching. Hi. Thanks always. And he explained to me, because in a recent video I said I wasn't sure, and I don't know if anyone's sure how to pronounce the name. So he explained it to me because he's friends with one of the guys who was in King Cobra with Carmine Appice. So here's the thing, I think it was Rod Stewart. I think it was with Rod Stewart. Rod Stewart said, you know, everybody keeps pronouncing your name different ways, so I'm just going to introduce you as Carmine Appice. And that's how it stayed, Carmine Appice. Now I have heard Appice, and apparently that is Carmine's brother, Vinny, who goes by Appice. And Bobby also told me there is a third brother who also goes by a different pronunciation. So you might hear Appice, you might hear Appice, you might hear Appice, you might be Appice, I don't know. But for this video here, we're starting with the drummer Carmine Appice. That's the name we're going with. Thanks, Bobby. Okay, so we're going to start with Vanilla Fudge, and I have here their 1968 album, Renaissance, which I think might just be my favorite Vanilla Fudge album. I think they really crank up the guitars on here, and fairly consistently as well. So going from Vanilla Fudge, okay, I'm gonna have to follow my notes here because it's a long story. So also in Vanilla Fudge, we have on bass Tim Bogert. Now, Tim Bogert and Carmine Appice wanted to do a band together with Jeff Beck, and actually Jeff Beck got in a car accident, and because of that car accident he couldn't join the band, and that band actually turned out to be Cactus. But they did do an album, Beck Bogart Appice. Here, I actually don't have this album, been thinking about it for a while, but they did that. Alright. But if we talk about Jeff Beck and go back to the 1960s, then of course Jeff Beck was a very important member of the Yardbirds. And last year when the late, great Jeff Beck passed away, was last year, right? I get lost. I made a video pointing out, I think it was like 10 moments with the Yardbirds where his guitar playing was really like a precursor to hard rock and heavy metal. So, of course, yes, Jeff Beck and the Yardbirds. Let's see, where is he here? Here he is. He's off to the side, and there's Jimmy Page. We're not going to follow Jimmy Page, so we're sticking with Jeff Beck here. So, let's see, Jeff Beck and the Yardbirds, and then also on vocals in the Yardbirds was Keith Relf. So, we're going to follow Keith Relf here. And when Keith Relf left the Yardbirds, I think it was him and drummer Jim McCarty, they decided to do a non-blues rock, hard rock, psychedelic rock band, and they started a band called Renaissance. Now, of course, Renaissance became very famous in the 1970s with a completely different lineup, because the original lineup of Renaissance just handed the name over to a whole new group of musicians who then carried on from there. So the original Renaissance only released 2 albums ever, and let's see here, where are the personnel? Well, there is, of course, Keith Relf, Jim McCarty, and the person I'm going with, I've forgotten his name again. Okay, so yes, Keith Relf and Jim McCartney, but the person I'm going with on here is Louis Sinamo, who plays bass. So he's a great guy to follow along with, because he's going to move us through here a little bit. So we're going to follow Louis Sinamo, who was with Renaissance, the original lineup. And we're going to follow him over to a band called Steamhammer. And this is an album called Speech. I think Steamhammer only ever did 3 albums. Some pretty cool stuff on here. And actually, one of the guitar lines in the opening very long track, I featured this in a previous video because the same guitar line was used in the opening track on this album here, Armageddon's album. Yeah, oh, it's Keith Relf again, yes, but it's also Louis Sinamo on bass. So Louis Sinamo went from Renaissance through to Steamhammer and over to Armageddon. Oh, I suppose he's one of these people here. So that's Louis Sinamo. Okay, we kind of followed the same guy through 3 different bands here, so it's time to move on. So aside from Keith Relf, there's another fellow on this album, Armageddon's album, and his name is Bobby Caldwell. Now Bobby Caldwell, drummer, he can be found playing drums on the first Captain Beyond album. There we go, Captain Beyond. Bobby Caldwell is the drummer. And, well, we've also got 2 of the Iron Butterfly guys on this album, but we also have the singer, Rod Evans. Okay, Rod Evans, we know what we heard of him before. That's right, Rod Evans was... Oh, I was pretty sure I picked out Shades of Deep Purple to show, but it looks like I picked out the Book of Taliesin. Alright, anyway, the first 3 Deep Purple albums have Rod Evans on vocals. And Rod Evans on vocals, also Nicky Simper on bass. We can find Nicky Simper around in various different places, but one of the places he shows up is on this album here, Quatermass 2, Long Road. Now, he was not part of the original Quatermass. However, one of the original Quatermass members, and I forget who it was, decided to put a Quatermass 2 band together, and Nicky Simper is playing bass on here. As well, guest on keyboards is Don Airey, whom we know from Deep Purple, as well as appearing on many other albums and with many other bands. But it is not Don Airey we're going to follow from Quatermass 2. We're going to follow drummer Mick Underwood. Because Mick Underwood, well, we heard about him playing drums in Gillen, right? And way back when, before that, he was also the drummer in episode 6. I think it was the 3rd drummer. I think they went through 3 drummers in episode 6, and the 3rd drummer, that was Mick Underwood. So Mick Underwood played in episode 6 with Roger Glover and Ian Gillan. No, we're not going back to Deep Purple, but Roger Glover is going to take us on over to Rainbow. Well, we could have gone to Deep Purple and then to Rainbow, but we're just going directly to Rainbow. So Roger Glover plays bass on, I think it was the last 3 Rainbow studio albums, and he's on this one here. Actually, also produced it, too. And of course, Don Airey is playing keyboards on here as well, but we're not following Don Airey. So, Roger Glover on here. Now, Rainbow. Who is the vocalist on this album here? Well, it's Joe Lynn Turner. Joe Lynn Turner makes his first appearance with Rainbow on this album, Difficult to Cure. So let's follow Joe Lynn Turner, because he's a guy who also gets around a lot. And in the 1990s, he shows up on an album, on a band called Mother's Army, who released 3 albums in the 1990s. So, Joe Lynn Turner is on here, as is Carmine Appice. He's on here too. But let me see, I think we are not going to follow Carmine Appice. Here's where we go off the road a little bit. We're going to follow, who else was on here? Oh yes, Jeff Watson. Alright, so, Jeff Watson. Well, where do we know Jeff Watson from? We know him from Night Ranger. And yes, I had the first 4 Night Ranger albums on cassette in the 1980s. And who else was with Night Ranger? Well, of course, it was Jack Blades. It was Jack Blades, right? Jeff Watson, Jack Blades. See, this is where when I make videos, I know exactly what I want to say, and then when I say it, I get it mixed up. So, Jack Blades was also the bass player, and Jack Blades appeared on the Damn Yankees album. And who is one of the main people behind Damn Yankees? Well, it is Ted Nugent. So here we get to go back into what I actually have in my hands. Ted Nugent. That brings us over to the Amboy Dukes, which was Ted Nugent's kind of first really big serious band, which eventually evolved into just Ted Nugent. It was the Amboy Dukes, it was Ted Nugent's Amboy Dukes, and then it was just Ted Nugent, where he officially made the cut from the Amboy Dukes. But anyway, this is the Amboy Dukes album. What was the album called? Migration, that's right. It's an album called Migration. Actually quite an interesting album. Looks like we have a young Ted Nugent there. I don't know if he was actually cool at that time. Not a nice thing to say. But the vocals on this album are done by one Mr. Rusty Day. So what do we know about Rusty Day? Well, we know that Rusty Day, I think that's him there. Rusty Day also sang for Cactus. Did we mention Cactus? We started with Vanilla Fudge. We could have mentioned Cactus, but we went to Vanilla Fudge. We said that Jeff Beck was he was asked to join to be part of Cactus, and he didn't. And you know who they got for guitars instead? They got a guy named Jim McCarty. Same name as the drummer for the Yardbirds, but different person. But anyway, Rusty Day. So Rusty Day is the vocalist for Cactus here. Now, we are not going to follow Carmine Appice here. We're not going to follow Tim Bogart either. We're going to follow Rusty Day because I remember now, Rusty Day sang on the first 3 Cactus albums, but on the 4th and final Cactus album, vocalist was Peter French. This is a compilation album, by the way, and I don't know, do I have the Peter French ones on here? Maybe a couple. But anyway, Peter French was the lead vocalist of the final Cactus album. And Peter French, of course he's in Leaf Hound, but he also shows up here on In the Hearing of Atomic Rooster album. Peter French is the vocalist on this album here. Now, if you talk about Atomic Rooster, who was the original drummer for Atomic Rooster on their first album? Why, it was Carl Palmer, of course. So, with Carl Palmer, that brings us over to Emerson, Lake and Palmer, ELP. Here's the debut album. Who's playing bass and doing vocals? Well, that would be Greg Lake. And where did Greg Lake come from before joining this? Greg Lake was on the first King Crimson album. Of course, doing the vocals there for 21st Century Schizoid Man. So we have Greg Lake here with King Crimson. And if we talk about King Crimson, well, one of the most important people, I think, in King Crimson's lineup at one point or another would have been this fellow here, Bill Bruford. Bill Bruford on drums. And where did Bill Bruford come from? Well, of course, before joining King Crimson, he came from Yes. And you know what? My box of Yes CDs is way down there at the back at the bottom, and I forgot to take out the Yes CD. But trust me, I have every one of the Yes studio albums. So yes, I have all the Yes albums with Bill Bruford. Here's an image. How about this one? Okay, so from Yes, of course, yes, we talk about Rick Wakeman. And I forgot to take out my Rick Wakeman CD as well. But Rick Wakeman had something called, what was it, the English Rock Ensemble? Sorry, I just needed a moment to confirm it was the English Rock Ensemble. That's right. So Rick Wakeman's solo work with the English Rock Ensemble, and Ashley Holt was his vocalist. Where do we know Ashley Holt from? Well, take a listen to the Warhorse albums, especially the first one anyway. Here, Warhorse, Ashley Holt on here. And you know what? Back at Warhorse, who's on bass? Oh yeah, that's right. It's Nick Simper, which brings us back to Deep Purple again. Okay. But we're not going to go back to early Deep Purple this time. Instead, yes, Nick Simper was there for the first 3 albums. We're going to move on ahead a little bit to an album that features Glenn Hughes on bass. And where do we know Glenn Hughes from? Well, my goodness, Glenn Hughes, before he joined Deep Purple, he was with a band called Trapeze. This is their 3rd album, Medusa. I think this is, this is their 2nd album, Medusa. He recorded 1 more with the band before moving on to Deep Purple. But, you know, who was in Medusa at this time? Well, drums was Dave Holland, which would bring us into Judas Priest territory. But we're going to go with guitarist Mel Galley, who was on here. And guitarist Mel Galley showed up on Whitesnake's Slide It In album. Now, as I've said before, every time I show this, this is not Slide It In. This is Slide It In, the self-titled album and Slip of the Tongue all together on one compilation. So let's just say that Mel Galley is playing here on this album. But let's see here with Whitesnake. No, we're not going to talk about David Coverdale and go back to Deep Purple. We're going to pick out John Sykes. John Sykes, who was playing guitar on here. And the reason why we're going with John Sykes is because John Sykes played in a band called Blue Murder. And who was the drummer for Blue Murder? Well, it was Carmine Appice, which means that we are going to go from Carmine Appice and go right back to Vanilla Fudge one more time. and that is where our journey will end. That, at long last, is my connections video. Why don't you try one of your own? Or if you want to add some branches to this big long loop I did, go right ahead, mention in the comments some things. I could have branched off in different directions multiple times throughout this, but it would have been like an amoeba monster with lots of cilia. So never mind, that's it. Okay everyone, thanks for watching. We'll be back with another video sometime shortly. Thanks, bye.